"Sir, you might not want to eat that." The words weren't spoken. They were written, folded twice, and slipped beneath a linen napkin so precisely it looked like part of the table setting. And yet, the moment Ethan Caldwell unfolded that small piece of paper, the entire room changed. His hand stopped halfway to his mouth, the steak knife hovering midair like it had forgotten its purpose. The low hum of conversation inside the restaurant continued, but around him, something went quiet, like the air itself had stepped back to watch. 10 minutes earlier, everything had been exactly the way Ethan liked it. The lighting was soft, amber-toned, designed to flatter power. Crystal glasses caught reflections of gold. The kind of place where deals weren't just made, they were performed. Ethan sat at the center of the table, tailored navy suit, posture effortless, the kind of presence that didn't ask for attention but expected it anyway. Across from him, two investors leaned in just slightly, not enough to seem eager, just enough to show they understood the stakes. A $180 million acquisition. Clean. Strategic. Inevitable. Ethan spoke in measured sentences, each word placed like a chess move, each pause calculated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Control, for him, was never loud. It was assumed. And then there was Naomi Brooks. She moved between tables like a shadow that had learned how to carry a tray. Early 20s, crisp uniform, posture straight, but never rigid. She didn't interrupt. She didn't hover. She simply existed in the narrow space people like Ethan rarely noticed unless something went wrong. To most of the room, she was invisible. To Ethan, she was functional. Medium rare, he had said earlier, barely glancing at her, his eyes already returning to the conversation before she could even nod. It wasn't rude. Not by his standards. It was efficient. Naomi had written it down anyway. Not because she needed to remember, but because she had learned that writing things down made people feel heard, even when they weren't. Back in the kitchen, the orders blurred together, heat rising off grills, voices overlapping, plates sliding across stainless steel counters. But Naomi wasn't thinking about the steak. She was thinking about what she had overheard. Not from Ethan. Never from Ethan directly. It was the man seated to his right, the one who laughed a little. Too easily, who had leaned in just far enough and spoken just quietly enough to think no one else could hear. A number. A name. A detail that didn't match. It had been small. Almost nothing. The kind of inconsistency that disappears in rooms like this, buried under confidence and expensive wine. Unless you knew what to listen for. Naomi did. Because when you spend your life being overlooked, you learn to hear everything. When she returned to the table, the steak was perfect. A clean sear, juices settled, presentation flawless. She placed the plate in front of Ethan with steady hands. No hesitation. No signal. Just service. And then, in one smooth motion, she adjusted the napkin. That was it. No eye contact. No pause. She turned and walked away before the moment could be questioned. Ethan didn't notice at first. Why would he? The conversation continued. Numbers. Projections. Confidence wrapped in certainty. He picked up his knife, cut into the steak, lifted the first bite, and then his fingers brushed the edge of the folded paper. A small interruption. Barely there. He frowned slightly, more out of irritation than curiosity, and unfolded it without thinking. 5 seconds later, the man who controlled the room didn't move at all. The paper was small, no larger than a business card, but the weight of it in Ethan Caldwell's hand felt disproportionate, like it carried something far heavier than ink. His eyes scanned the single line written in clean, deliberate handwriting, and for a moment, his expression did not change. Then it did. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would draw immediate attention. Just a subtle tightening around the eyes. A pause that stretched a fraction too long. Across the table, one of the investors continued speaking, outlining projected returns with the kind of confidence that usually impressed men like Ethan. We are looking at a conservative 12% growth in the first 18 months, he said, gesturing lightly with his glass. But Ethan did not respond. He was still looking at the note. Because the sentence on that paper did not argue. It did not accuse. It simply stated something that should not have been possible for anyone outside that conversation to know. A number. The same number he had just heard whispered minutes earlier. And beneath it, 6 words. Check the filing from last Thursday. His thumb pressed slightly against the edge of the card, as if grounding himself in something physical. The room continued moving around him, forks lifting, glasses clinking, voices blending into a polished hum of wealth and certainty. But inside his head, something had shifted. Not panic. Ethan Caldwell did not panic. But recalculation. Fast. Precise. Relentless. He replayed the last 10 minutes in silence. Every word, every pause, every glance exchanged between the two men across from him. The number had come from the one on the right. Casual. Almost careless. But now it no longer felt that way. Ethan lowered his fork slowly, placing it beside the plate with deliberate control. "Excuse me," he said, his tone even, measured, giving nothing away. The men across from him paused, slightly confused, but nodded. Of course. Take your time. They assumed he was stepping away to take a call. That was what men like him did. He stood, smoothing his jacket with one hand, the other still holding the folded note. His eyes lifted briefly, scanning the room, not for exits, not for threats, but for her. Naomi Brooks was near the far side of the dining room, refilling water at another table, her movements as quiet and efficient as before. She did not look at him. Not once. As if nothing had happened. As if she had not just reached into a conversation worth $180 million and altered its gravity with a single line of ink. Ethan studied her for half a second longer than necessary, then turned away, walking toward the private hallway near the restrooms. The lighting there was cooler, less forgiving, the gold tones replaced by something more neutral, more real. He pulled out his phone, unlocking it with a quick motion, his fingers already moving before doubt could catch up. Search. Company registry. Filing records. Thursday. The screen loaded. One document. Then another. And then he saw it. The number. Not matching. Not even close. A discrepancy large enough to shift the entire foundation of the deal. Large enough to turn projected growth into something far less stable. His jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. He had not been wrong to trust his instincts. But he had missed this. And someone at that table had hoped he would. Ethan exhaled slowly, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened edge of the screen. For the first time that night, the room no longer belonged entirely to him. And somewhere behind him, beyond the polished walls and quiet conversations, a waitress who had never been part of the deal had just changed it completely. When Ethan Caldwell stepped back into the dining room, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The same soft amber light still bathed the tables. The same quiet jazz still floated through the air, and the same polished conversations continued as if the world had not shifted by a single inch. But Ethan walked differently now. Not slower. Not rushed. Sharper. Like every step had a purpose he had not fully revealed yet. He returned to his seat with a calm that would have looked like control to anyone watching, but his eyes were no longer relaxed. They were searching, measuring, calculating angles that had not existed 20 minutes ago. "Everything good?" the investor on his left asked, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Ethan nodded once as he picked up his glass of water instead of the wine. "Just confirming a detail," he said, his tone neutral, almost dismissive. The kind of answer that usually ended questions. But this time it did not, because now he knew what to listen for. He let the conversation resume, leaning back slightly, giving them the floor, allowing confidence to fill the space again. People revealed more when they believed the moment had passed. And within seconds, it began. Small things at first. A repeated phrase. A projection that did not align with the document he had just seen. The man on the right spoke with the same easy charm, the same relaxed confidence, but now every word felt rehearsed. Polished. Too clean. Ethan watched him without interrupting, his fingers resting lightly against the table, his expression composed. Then he leaned forward just enough to shift the energy. "Walk me through the Thursday filing again," he said, casually, as if it were a minor clarification. The man blinked once. Just once. But it was enough. "Of course," he replied quickly, a fraction too quickly, launching into an explanation that sounded correct on the surface. Numbers flowed. Terminology aligned. But the foundation was wrong. Ethan did not stop him. Not yet. He let him continue. Let him build the structure higher, more detailed, more confident. Because the higher it stood, the harder it would fall. Across the table, the second investor shifted slightly in his seat, his smile tightening at the edges. He was beginning to feel it too. Not the problem itself, but the tension. The subtle shift in control. Ethan reached for his phone, placing it face up on the table this time. Not hidden, not private. The screen lit briefly, the document still open, the discrepancy clear to anyone who knew where to look. Because this version, Ethan said calmly, tapping the screen once, does not match what you are describing. Silence. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the kind that settles slowly, like dust after something invisible has cracked. The man on the right hesitated, his words catching for the first time that evening. There may have been a revision, he offered, but even he did not sound convinced. Ethan held his gaze, steady, unblinking, not raising his voice, not accusing. He did not need to. The truth was already doing the work for him. Around them, the restaurant continued its performance of elegance, but at this table, the script had changed. And for the first time that night, the men who had walked in expecting to impress him were now trying to recover. Ethan leaned back again, slower this time, reclaiming the space without force. His control had not returned. It had evolved. And somewhere across the room, Naomi Brooks continued moving between tables, unseen by most, untouched by the tension she had set in motion. She did not look over. She did not wait for acknowledgement. Because she already knew something Ethan was only just beginning to understand. Power is not always the one speaking the loudest. Sometimes, it is the one who knows exactly when to say nothing at all. The shift was subtle, but it was undeniable. The confidence that had once filled the table now felt thinner, like a performance that had lost its rhythm. The man on the right adjusted his cufflinks, a small movement, almost invisible, but his composure no longer carried the same weight. Ethan Caldwell did not rush to fill the silence. He let it stretch, let it settle into the space between them, because silence, when used correctly, did more than words ever could. I think we should take a closer look at the numbers before we continue, Ethan said finally, his voice calm, measured, leaving no room for argument without ever sounding aggressive. The second investor cleared his throat, offering a quick nod, eager to align himself with stability. That sounds reasonable, he replied, though his earlier certainty had faded. The first man forced a smile, but it did not hold. It flickered, just for a second, before slipping into something more cautious. Of course, he said, gathering his thoughts, but the momentum was gone. Completely. The deal that had felt inevitable now felt fragile, like glass under pressure. Ethan reached for his water again, not his wine, his movements deliberate, grounded. He was no longer playing along with their narrative. He was rewriting it. Around them, the restaurant continued untouched, waiters moving in practiced rhythm, plates arriving and leaving, conversations rising and falling in gentle waves. But at this table, the temperature had changed. And for the first time that evening, Ethan was not the only one aware of it. The man on the right leaned forward, attempting to regain control. There may have been an internal update that did not reflect in the public filing, he said, choosing his words carefully now, no longer relaxed, no longer careless. Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying him, not with hostility, but with precision. Then that raises a different question, Ethan replied evenly. Why would an internal update differ from what is legally filed? No accusation, no raised voice, just a question that did not need to be repeated. The kind of question that did not leave room for easy answers. The man hesitated again, longer this time. Across the table, his partner shifted, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something closer to concern. Because now it was not just about numbers. It was about credibility. Ethan let the silence return, heavier this time, more deliberate. He did not press further. He did not need to. The pressure was already in place. And then, almost as an afterthought, he spoke again. I do not move forward on uncertainty, he said, his tone steady. Final, the kind of sentence that closed doors without slamming them. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be, because everyone at the table understood what it meant. The deal was no longer theirs to win. It was theirs to salvage. And they were already losing. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed once more, but this time, it was different. Not the effortless control from before, but something sharper, earned in real time. His eyes moved briefly across the room again, almost unconsciously. And there she was, Naomi Brooks, standing near the edge of the dining area, quietly placing a glass of water in front of another guest, her expression calm, unchanged, as if she had not altered the trajectory of a $180 million negotiation with a single piece of paper. She did not look at him. Not even once. No acknowledgement. No expectation. Just quiet, consistent presence. Ethan held that glance for half a second longer than necessary, something unreadable passing through his expression before he looked away. Because for the first time that night, he was not the only one who had seen everything clearly. And the person who had changed the outcome was the one no one had bothered to see at all. The deal did not collapse all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from a perfectly tailored suit. One question led to another. One inconsistency exposed the next, and the confidence that had once filled the table now felt like something borrowed, something temporary that no longer belonged. The man on the right spoke less. When he did, his words carried hesitation, a carefulness that had not been there before. The second investor no longer leaned forward. He leaned back now, arms crossing loosely, creating distance not just physically, but strategically. Ethan Caldwell did not interrupt. He did not press harder than necessary. He simply allowed the truth to surface on its own, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to defend. We will need time to clarify these discrepancies, the second investor said finally, his tone measured, but no longer confident. It was not a suggestion. It was a retreat. Ethan nodded once, slow and deliberate. Take all the time you need, he replied, his voice even, giving them exactly what they were asking for and nothing more. The meaning was clear. The momentum was gone. The leverage had shifted, and everyone at the table knew it. The check arrived shortly after, placed quietly at the edge of the table, as if even that simple act understood the tension in the air. Ethan reached for it without looking, sliding his card forward with the same calm precision he had carried all evening. Control had returned, but it was different now. Not assumed. Verified. As the men gathered their things, offering polite handshakes and carefully neutral expressions, Ethan stood with them, his posture composed, his face unreadable. We will follow up, one of them said, forcing a professional smile. Ethan returned it, but only slightly. I am sure you will, he answered. No hostility. No accusation. Just certainty. They left the restaurant moments later, their earlier confidence replaced by quiet urgency, their steps quicker than when they had arrived. Ethan remained standing for a second longer, watching the door close behind them, the reflection of the city lights flickering across the glass. Then he exhaled. Not relief. Not quite. Something closer to recognition. Because the outcome had not come from his strategy alone. And he knew it. Slowly, he turned his attention back to the room, his eyes moving with intention this time, not scanning for threats or opportunities, but for her. Naomi Brooks was near the service station now, placing a stack of plates onto a tray with steady hands, her movements unchanged, her expression calm, as if nothing about this night had required her to step outside her role. To anyone else, she was still just a waitress, still part of the background, still invisible. Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out the folded note once more, unfolding it carefully, reading the same line again. The same number, the same instruction. Simple, precise, enough to change everything. He looked up again, this time walking toward her, not with urgency, not with hesitation, but with a kind of focus that had not been there before. Each step closed the distance between them, the noise of the restaurant continuing around him, untouched, unaware. Naomi sensed him before she saw him, not because he made noise, but because presence like his was hard to ignore up close. She finished placing the last plate, adjusted the tray slightly, and then turned. For the first time that night, their eyes met. There was no shock in hers. No expectation. Just quiet awareness. Ethan stopped a few feet away, holding her gaze for a moment that lasted just long enough to mean something. He did not speak immediately, because for the first time that night, he understood something he had not understood before. Not everything valuable announces itself, and not everyone who changes the outcome asks to be seen. Ethan did not reach out his hand. He did not introduce himself. He did not do any of the things men in his position usually did when they wanted to establish control over a conversation. Instead, he stood there, just long enough to acknowledge that something had already shifted, something that did not require a title or an announcement. Naomi Brooks met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, as if this moment carried no more weight than the last glass she had just placed on a table. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, but the space between them felt separate, almost insulated from everything else. Ethan glanced down briefly at the folded note in his hand, then back at her. "You wrote this," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. His voice was calm, lower now, stripped of the performative tone he had used at the table earlier. Naomi did not rush to answer. She did not apologize. She did not explain. "Yes," she said simply. One word. Clear. Uncomplicated. Ethan studied her for a moment, not with the detached evaluation he used in boardrooms, but with something closer to curiosity. "How did you know?" he asked. It was not suspicion. It was precision. Naomi shifted the tray slightly in her hands, balancing the weight without effort. "I listened," she replied. Again, simple. But this time, there was something beneath it. Not defiance. Not pride. Just truth. Ethan exhaled quietly, a subtle acknowledgement that her answer was both sufficient and complete. He glanced back toward the table where the remnants of the meeting still sat, the untouched steak, the half-full glasses, the space where a deal had almost been signed. "That information was not public," he said, more to himself than to her. Naomi's eyes did not move. "No," she agreed. Silence followed, but it was not uncomfortable. It was deliberate, the kind of silence that allowed meaning to settle without being forced. Ethan looked at her again, this time differently. Not as someone passing through his environment, not as part of the background he had learned to ignore, but as someone who had altered an outcome he would have otherwise accepted. "You could have said nothing," he said after a moment. Naomi nodded once. "Yes." "Why did you not?" Ethan asked. There was no challenge in his tone, no expectation of a certain answer, just a question that mattered. Naomi's grip on the tray remained steady, but her voice, when she spoke, carried something deeper than before. "Because you were about to trust something that was not true," she said. No embellishment, no attempt to impress, just a statement of fact. Ethan held her gaze, the weight of her words settling in a way numbers and contracts never quite did. For a man who built his life on control, on certainty, on the idea that he saw everything that mattered, this moment carried a quiet contradiction. He had not seen it. She had, and she had chosen to act. Not for recognition, not for reward, just because it was the right thing to do. Ethan looked down at the note one more time, then folded it carefully, more deliberately than before, as if it deserved a different kind of handling now. When he looked back up, something in his expression had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention from across the room, but enough. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they did not sound like something he said often. Naomi gave a small nod, nothing more, accepting the acknowledgement without holding on to it. Because for her, the moment had already passed. There were still tables to serve, still orders to carry, still a shift to finish. And as Ethan stepped back slightly, creating space where there had once only been distance, he understood something that no deal, no number, no boardroom had ever taught him. The most important voice in the room is often the one no one thinks to hear. Naomi did not wait for anything more. No follow-up. No conversation extended beyond what was necessary. She turned slightly, shifting the tray back into position against her palm, and stepped away with the same quiet efficiency that had defined her all night. To anyone watching, nothing about the exchange would have seemed unusual. A brief interaction. A server and a guest. Routine. Forgettable. But Ethan Caldwell did not return to his seat. He remained standing where she had left him, the folded note still in his hand, his attention no longer pulled toward deals or numbers or outcomes. Instead, it lingered on something far less measurable. He watched her move across the room, weaving between tables with practiced ease, adjusting a glass here, placing a plate there, never rushing, never hesitating. There was a rhythm to it, a consistency that did not depend on who was watching, or if anyone was watching at all. Ethan had spent years building systems that optimized performance, scaled efficiency, eliminated unpredictability. He believed in structure, in control, in knowing. And yet tonight, the most important variable in the room had been something he did not see coming. Not because it was hidden, but because he had not been looking for it. He walked back toward his table slowly, his steps measured, his posture still composed, but his focus altered. The untouched steak remained where he had left it, the surface now cooling under the ambient light, no longer the center of his attention. He sat down, but he did not reach for the utensils. Instead, he placed the note on the table in front of him, flattening it carefully with his fingers, as if giving it space. Around him, the restaurant continued its quiet performance of elegance, but the scene no longer held the same meaning. The details were the same. The significance was not. A manager approached briefly, polite, attentive, offering a practiced smile. "Is everything to your satisfaction this evening, sir?" Ethan looked up, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, the question seemed larger than the context it was asked in. "Satisfaction." He nodded once. "Yes," he said, his tone calm, but thoughtful, as if the answer carried more weight than expected. The manager smiled, relieved, and moved on. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting again toward the far side of the room, where Naomi now stood speaking quietly with another staff member, her expression focused, her attention fully on the task at hand. No glance in his direction. No acknowledgement. Just presence. Consistent. Grounded. Unchanged. He considered calling her back. It would have been easy. A simple gesture. A word. An offer, perhaps. Something transactional. Something that fit within the rules he understood. But he did not. Because for the first time, he recognized that what she had done did not belong in that framework. It was not a service. It was not a favor. It was not something that could be measured or repaid in the usual ways. It stood outside of that. Independent. Complete on its own. Ethan reached for his glass of water again, taking a slow sip, the coolness grounding him in the moment. His eyes lowered briefly to the note once more, the ink unchanged, the message still as precise as it had been the first time he read it. But now, it carried something else. Not just information. Perspective. He had walked into the room expecting to control the outcome. And in the end, the outcome had been shaped by someone who had never been part of the plan. Someone who did not ask to be included. Someone who did not need to be recognized to act. Ethan exhaled quietly, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but real. Because in a room built on power, influence, and visibility, the person who had mattered most had been the one no one had seen at all. The restaurant began to thin out as the night moved forward, the steady rhythm of service softening into something quieter, more intimate. Conversations grew lower, laughter less frequent, the sharp edge of business slowly dissolving into the comfort of late evening indulgence. But Ethan Caldwell remained where he was, not because he had nowhere else to be, but because for the first time in a long time, he was not in a hurry to leave. His phone sat untouched beside him, screen dark, notifications ignored. The world that usually demanded his attention could wait. Across the room, Naomi Brooks continued her shift with the same consistency, the same quiet precision that had defined every movement she made. There was no change in her pace, no adjustment in her demeanor, no indication that anything significant had occurred. She cleared plates, refilled glasses, answered questions with calm professionalism. The same as before. And yet, Ethan saw her differently now. Not because she had tried to be seen, but because he had finally looked. A couple at a nearby table thanked her as she placed their dessert, their voices warm, appreciative. She nodded, offered a small, polite smile, and moved on without lingering. No expectation. No attachment to the acknowledgement. Just presence. Ethan noticed that too. The way she moved through each interaction without carrying any of it forward. Efficient. Grounded. Self-contained. He picked up the note again, running his fingers lightly over the fold, not reading it this time, but feeling the texture, the simplicity of it. A small piece of paper. No signature. No explanation. Just enough. He had built his life. Around complexity, around layers of information, contracts, negotiations that stretched for weeks, sometimes months. And yet tonight, the most important shift had come from something that took less than 10 seconds to write. That contrast did not escape him. A server passed by his table, offering to clear the untouched steak. Ethan glanced at the plate, then shook his head slightly. "You can take it," he said, his tone calm, no frustration, no disappointment. The meal had served its purpose, even if not in the way it was intended. The server nodded and removed the plate quietly, leaving behind a clean space where something had almost been consumed. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his gaze drifting once more toward Naomi. She was near the bar now, speaking briefly with the bartender, her posture relaxed but attentive, her focus fully present in whatever task she was handling. There was no sign of performance. No effort to impress. Just consistency. And for a man who had spent years navigating rooms filled with calculated behavior, that stood out more than anything else. He thought about the deal again, not with frustration, but with clarity. How easily it could have gone through. How clean it would have looked on paper. How confident he had been just an hour ago. And how wrong that confidence would have been. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of tension, but out of understanding. Because what had changed tonight was not just the outcome of a negotiation. It was the lens through which he viewed control itself. He had always believed that control came from seeing everything. From knowing every detail, every number, every angle before anyone else did. But tonight had shown him something different. Control is not just about what you see. It is about what you are willing to notice. His eyes moved one last time across the room, finding Naomi again, not because she stood out, but because she no longer blended into the background the way she once had. And as the night continued to settle around them, one thing became quietly undeniable. The room had not changed. The people had not changed. But the way he saw it all had. By the time the last tables were cleared, the restaurant had settled into that quiet, almost reflective stillness that only came at the end of a long night. The lights felt softer now, less about presentation and more about closure. Chairs were being adjusted, glasses stacked, the subtle signals that the evening was coming to an end. Ethan Caldwell remained seated a moment longer than necessary, his posture relaxed, his attention no longer tied to outcomes or negotiations, but to something far less tangible. Across the room, Naomi Brooks wiped down a table with steady, unhurried movements, her focus unchanged, her presence as grounded as it had been from the beginning. There was no indication that this night would mean anything more to her than any other shift. No pause, no reflection, just continuation. Ethan finally stood, adjusting his jacket slightly, the motion familiar but the intention behind it different. He did not check his phone. He did not rush toward the exit. Instead, he walked once more through the space, not as someone who owned the room, but as someone who had learned something inside it. As he passed by the service station, Naomi was placing the last set of polished glasses onto a tray, her movements precise, practiced. She glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes for just a second. Not a long look, not a searching one, just acknowledgement. Present. Real. Enough. Ethan gave a small nod, subtle but intentional, a gesture that carried more meaning than anything he had said earlier. No words followed. None were needed. Because whatever had needed to be said had already been written, already been understood. He continued toward the exit, the quiet hum of the restaurant fading behind him as the glass doors opened to the cool night air. The city stretched out in front of him, lights reflecting off passing cars, distant sounds blending into a steady rhythm of life moving forward. For a man who was used to measuring success in numbers, in deals closed and margins secured, tonight offered something that could not be calculated. A shift, not in his status, not in his power, but in his awareness. He paused for a brief moment just outside the entrance, the folded note still in his pocket, its presence no longer urgent, but permanent, because it represented more than a warning. It represented a perspective he had overlooked, and now could not ignore. Inside, Naomi continued her work, finishing what remained of her shift, her world unchanged in all the ways that mattered to her. No headlines. No recognition. No audience. Just quiet consistency. And yet, without asking for it, without announcing it, she had altered the course of something far beyond her role. Ethan took a slow breath, looking out at the city one more time before stepping forward, merging back into a world that still operated on the same rules it always had. But he no longer saw those rules the same way. Because that night, in a room built on power, money, and control, the most important decision had not come from the man at the head of the table. It had come from the person no one thought to look at. She did not argue. She did not interrupt. She did not demand to be heard. She simply acted. And in doing so, she did something far greater than change a deal. She changed the way power was understood. Because power, real power, is not always the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it is the quiet hand that knows exactly when to move.